So welcome everyone to Just Transition in Action, a trade union perspective. This event is brought to you by the International Trade Union Confederation, including its Just Transition Center, and also by our co-hosts, the UK and Canadian governments, and Wilton Park. In this session, you're going to hear a bit more about just transition. We all heard the UN Secretary General yesterday. He gave us a call to action on the energy transition, but it was also a call to action on just transition. And in this session, you're going to hear from trade union leaders, but also from some of our social partners, governments and employers, about how exactly you get just transition on the ground. A few practical things before I turn over to our moderator, ITUC General Secretary Sharon Burrow. So first of all, this session will be in English only, so sorry, but no interpretation. And second, it is, of course, one of a number of different sessions that make up the PPCA Summit. So at 4 o'clock, there's going to be another session about retiring coal assets early, where you can hear another ITUC speaker, Allison Tate. And if you missed any of the earlier sessions and you think you'd like to listen to them, they will also be available online. So without further ado, I would like to turn over to ITUC General Secretary Sharon Burrow, who's going to give us a keynote address and then moderate the session, and then we can speak a bit more at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. And this is indeed a critical discussion because the lessons from indeed just transition in coal are lessons, as Sam said, we need to take into other areas of the economy, because we know to stabilize the planet, we need to transition all sectors. But let me give you a contextual frame first. COVID-19 has exposed the global fractures that already existed, historical levels of inequality, the climate crisis, and indeed a deteriorating labour market. We've seen with COVID-19 that indeed the loss of millions, hundreds of millions of jobs, potentially adding up last year's final net tally and this year around 400 million, and that's in the formal economy. In the informal economy, of course, we have 60% of the global workforce absolutely struggling just to survive every day because they have no rights, no wage, no minimum wages, no social protection. So we need a new social contract that repairs the labour market, stabilises the planet and ensures, as Sam said, a just transition in the process. People need jobs, climate-friendly jobs with just transition. All sectors must transition, as I said, but we cannot accept stranded people or stranded communities. Transition measures are essential for the ambition and the imperative of phasing out the use of coal as part of our energy mix. Workers and their unions are on the front lines of securing just transition plans, and some of our heroes will speak to you today because this is the most painful exercise you can possibly engage in, telling strong unions and their members who've built communities that in fact life will be different in the future, that their jobs in their current form will no longer exist. And of course, we know the devastation from COVID-19 requires new levels of care, of social protection, of economic stimulus in all countries. We know the same is true for the climate crisis, with just 10 years to actually effect that stabilisation and see a global reduction of at least 45% of emissions. So a COVID-19 ravaged world will need a just transition if people are to have hopes. The loss of trust in democracy is something we can't ignore. Less than 50% of the world's people now live in democracies. And indeed, even within those democratic countries, the increase in the number of authoritarian governments is extraordinary. So just transition for us is a simple set of measures: secure pensions, income support and skills training in the face of job transition or displacement, prevailing wage rates in new jobs. You can't have jobs in the renewable energy sector that indeed are poor quality, low paid jobs and expect people to accept transition. And of course, investment and renewal in affected communities to secure those vital jobs. These measures will be trusted where governments involve workers through their unions in social dialogue. So we say to the world, a new social contract is vital to set the world back on a sustainable and a just path. The terms of this contract must have jobs, climate-friendly jobs, as we said, with just transition, but rights, universal social protection, equality of income, race and gender, and inclusion, a new development model that allows the world to share in its wealth. I think, as Sam said, the UN Secretary General's words yesterday are worth repeating. We should repeat them everywhere. He said, we have a collective and urgent responsibility to address the serious challenges that come with the speed and scale of the transition. The needs of coal communities must be recognised and concrete solutions must be provided at a very local level. It requires engagement from governments to power companies, from labour unions to investors, both private and public. He called on all governments, all countries to embrace the International Labour Organisation's guidelines for a just transition and adopt them as the minimum standard to ensure progress on decent work for all. He pledged the United Nations full support for this just transition and efforts to ensure that thriving and prosperous renewable energy communities emerge from the transformation. He said, Excellencies, dear friends, we can have renewable energy and blue skies. We can have decent, healthy and reliable jobs. We can have dependable, renewable power systems and ensure everyone has access to energy. We can power past coal and have economies that thrive on innovative business aligned to what the world is demanding, sustainable development and prosperity for the people and the planet. We can make all of this happen together. That's a pretty incredible message from the leader of the UN. We couldn't have written it better ourselves. So we know that we want a new social contract for all workers, but it must in fact ensure that we leave no one behind. So I'm delighted to be with you today and to moderate indeed the panels. We have some great panelists and I'm very proud of our trade unions, but I also thank our social partners and our, of course, our co-hosts, as Samantha did. So let me introduce each panelist in order as I come to them. I want to introduce Tara Peel. Tara is a great friend of all of us from the Canadian Labour Congress, and I know because I watched the pain of seeing their work give, born out of the struggle and the despair of workers who were worried and still remain worried about the future. So I want to actually ask you, Tara, the Canadian Labour Congress globally has been a bit of a union movement leader in this and the issue of just transition. You pushed for and then you co-chaired Canada's National Task Force on Just Transition for coal workers and communities. Tell us about the recommendations that came out of that task force and what did unions bring to the process that would have otherwise been missing? But also, looking to the future, what does your government need to do now to ensure that the energy transition creates good union jobs in Canada so no worker is left behind? Tara, welcome.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, everyone, for having me here today. I'll just start by saying that I'm speaking today from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, otherwise known as Ottawa, Canada. I think in your opening remarks, Sharon, you spoke to a lot of the things that were the focus of our Just Transition Task Force for Coal Power Workers. When our federal government announced the coal phase out of coal-fired electricity by 2030, the labor movement in Canada supported that, despite recognizing that it would have an impact on our members' jobs. We knew that it was the right thing to do for the health of the planet and also for the health of Canadians. But we were very clear that affected workers and communities could not be expected to shoulder the burden of this phase out alone. This is a fundamental question of fairness. It is also a fundamental question of ambition. In Canada, there are still 4 provinces that burn coal for electricity at various phases of moving away from it. One province, Alberta, the province with the most coal power reliance and also with the most affected workers and communities, was a little further down the road than we were. The provincial government had announced an end date for coal by 2029, and through the hard work of the labor movement in that province, there had been some progress made on providing a package of supports for workers. To help, make and there are some interesting collaborations in that process in Alberta. The Federation of Labor there partnered with a number of mayors and reeves of small towns and communities that were affected. Certainly in Canada, I don't know if this is a case everywhere. Coal is very localized, often in very small towns. And while I won't say it's the only job in town, it is by far, they tend to be the best paying, most key jobs in those communities. So partnering with those mayors and reeves in those towns, they called for a plan that supported workers in affected communities. And indeed, the government in Alberta came forward with about a $40 million transition plan. So just to speak a little bit more about our task force federally, when we started our work in 2018, we knew that there are things to learn from Alberta, and so we headed there first. In all of these provinces, we met with workers and their unions, employers in the industry, local governments, chambers of commerce, and community economic development groups. And they all sort of spoke to some of their fears and some of their frustrations that you hinted at, and some questions about whether the new jobs would be good jobs and would they support their families. In many of these communities, the income from the mines and the generating plants not only supported these families, but they sort of subsidized the family farm income. So there was a real potential trickle-down effect of what it would mean. Towns were also clear that if these, as these jobs went away, there was, and if there was not investment to allow these communities to have sort of a second act, that they, potentially would lose not only these workers, but also teachers and doctors and nurses and volunteer hockey coaches and volunteer firefighters and all of that. So I will say that with a very diverse composition of our task force, including a CEO of a former Crown Corporation Power Corporation that had significant coal assets, including a councillor from an affected community, an affected municipality, strong representation from the unions that directly represent those workers in that sector, as well as experts in climate and in workforce transitions. Our recommendations were unanimous. And so I'll work through those quickly, and I think they do stand up to the test of time, and they do, I think, provide a bit of a window for what is needed next. Our recommendations, there were some sort of foundational recommendations, including one around transparency, so that we continue to monitor and evaluate and publicly report on just transition activities, including naming a lead minister to drive that. There was a recommendation to include just transition provisions in federal environment and labor legislation, as well as in relevant intergovernmental agreements with the provinces and territories in a federated country like Canada. There is a division of responsibilities and division of responsibilities and purview. There's a recommendation to have a targeted long-term research funding so that we could learn from this transition and see how it might affect future transitions. There was a recommendation as well to fund locally driven transition centers, and I expect that my colleague from the government may speak a little bit to that in her presentation. There certainly has been a commitment on that front from the federal government, including budgetary allocations of about $185 million, and much of it so far dedicated to funding local transition centers. We did also hear a lot from workers who were later in their working life and perhaps not in a position to reskill and retrain for new work, but not close enough to retirement to be able to retirement with the pension that they had worked for and weren't, should be entitled to. So we did have a recommendation about pension bridging. This, of course, is not an uncomplicated thing, as pension structures varied not only by region, but also workplace to workplace. And that was one of those places where there needed to be ongoing work with affected workers through their unions to make sure that workers who have, through no fault of their own, will be asked to leave their job before they had planned, that they should not be denied a dignified retirement, as no workers should be. And then there were a number of recommendations around specifically related to worker transitions for workers who are going to remain in the labor force. One of the things that we heard over and over again from these workers was that this workforce represented a skilled, talented, diverse set of skills, but in some of these towns, it was hard to figure out how to let people know about that. And so we recommended there be that governments create a detailed, publicly available inventory with labor market information related to coal workers, including skills profiles of the workers that are there. We often talk about the need for reskilling and upskilling, and I think that is absolutely true, but we shouldn't forget that there is also a very skilled workforce in these towns. And just as a bit of an aside, we heard from workers often who had worked their whole careers for one employer, and it maybe wasn't in the employer's interest all the time for those workers to be certified for the skills that they had, because then they might be able to take those to another workplace. And so now that we knew that we were in a transition period, these workers need to have the reskilling and upskilling they need, and certification for existing skills while they're on the job, to try to limit the gap between employment. We also recommended a range of supports for workers through all of the stages of securing a new job: income supports, education and skills building, support for reemployment activities, as potentially wage top-ups, and mobility supports. As I said, often these coal communities are sort of quite rural and remote, and there's a likelihood that many of these workers may need to either travel distances or relocate to find new work. We recommended an investment in infrastructure in affected communities, of course, so that these communities could figure out what their second act would be. Funding community planning and collaboration, diversification and stabilization. We heard from communities that that they were taking all of their economic development resources, often one or two people, completely focusing on the coal phase out and really having a hard time to focus on the work that needed to be done to attract new investment. So, what's next? And I'll wrap it up quickly. I know we have others who have a lot to bring. The government announced recently the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act in November, and just recently named the permanent advisory body to make sure that work continues to review the plans. And the president of the Canadian Labour Congress was named to that body, and I think that will be important. That just transition is a key driver of ambition, and we won't meet those milestones if we don't include just transition. So that will be important. We need to make sure, Sharon, as you said, that these new jobs are good jobs. We can't expect people to trade jobs where they've collectively bargained their wages and working conditions for precarious, low-wage, insecure jobs with not a lot related to retirement security. And then Canada's a big country with very diverse regions. This transition is happening at various paces across the country. And so there is a need for an ongoing role for just transition. We are keen to work with the government on a Just Transition Act that would allow that to happen, not only for coal workers, but learning the lessons from this transition for coal workers for a broader transition. I think I'll leave it there. And thank you for having me today.
So thank you, Tara, and indeed for your leadership and your work, because it takes a lot of work and a lot of dedication to this. I should have said Tara is the National Director for Health, Safety and Environment, the Canadian Labour Congress. So a big job, and made bigger through COVID and the exposure, of course, of the health and safety risks. So thank you, Tara. Apparently, Ainsley's having some problems with her video, so I'm going to just come back to her by her request and go to Bill, who is the Regional Secretary for Yorkshire and Humber, the Trade Union Congress, of course. And Bill, we know that the UK's transition out of coal power and mining was anything but just. It created and indeed left deindustrialised regions, but regions that were stripped of hope for the future. So talk to us about not only how this impacted the coal workers in these regions and what the TUC's regional approach to get good jobs has been, but how in fact we make sure that there's a just transition for workers in the power and heavy industry sectors now, given all of that experience. And what do unions want from the government and employers to create good jobs and drive this just transition? Because, to be honest, your government's in the firing line this year. It talks big about climate ambition, just transition, good jobs, but what do we need to do to get it, Bill?
Okay, well, thanks, Sharon, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm coming from the largest county in England of Yorkshire, and very industrialised it used to be, but we hope to be in the future. I'm the secretary of the regional TUC. We represent 48 unions, and we have approximately just over 600,000 members in our region. So I think, I'm delighted to be able to talk to you all today. I think we have an amazing opportunity to change the way we do things in the UK. And given the urgency of the tasks ahead of us, we need to form genuine, trusting social and economic partnerships, not only to reach net zero and save the planet, but create the conditions for a fairer world and a just transition for workers and everyone else. I have to say a little bit about the past because it's very, very important about how we look at the future. In the 1980s, we had over 60,000 jobs in coal mining in our region alone, and tens of more thousands in engineering, manufacturing, and services dependent on those mining jobs. Many of the pits were very concentrated into West and South Yorkshire communities. And the government at the time decided to close a large number of the pits purely on economic grounds, which led to massive industrial unrest, of what we've not seen before or since in the coal fields. And in the years that followed, all the pits were accelerated for closure, and the last deep mine was closed in 2017 at Kellingby Colliery. These areas are still feeling the effects of that shock to the economy. And rather than being labelled left behind communities, I would argue that they've been abandoned. Very high rates of unemployment, poverty, social exclusion, depopulation, low attainment, loss of hope, and that leads to many other social problems for those areas. With generations of unemployed people, children in those areas not understanding what work is, many suffering from industrial health issues, drug abuse and alcohol dependency, which usually follows those kind of issues. I just want to read to you a quick quote from a miner at the time, which I think sets the tone for what I'm about to talk about this afternoon. People say that closures were inevitable, but they weren't, says Nicky Wilson. who was working at a colliery when the strike began. I still believe in what the strike was about, and I would do it again. We were not only fighting for wages and conditions, but we were also fighting for the very existence of our jobs, our industry, and our communities. That's why it lasted so long. The miners' union today, for example, continue to represent their members, mainly fighting industrial compensation cases for people who've been left ill by their job and for people who are still left in those communities. Yet I'm here today as a trade union representative, fighting for those and many other workers and their families who've been displaced or even discarded by deindustrialisation, sometimes just by receiving a text message from their employer telling them that they're no longer required. Yes, there was some government money. It was small to redevelop industry in parts of our region. A few well-known logistics businesses have set up shop and are still trading, but many of the jobs they provided are low paid, low skilled, many of them precarious, and are very often done by the grandchildren of those ex-miners who must be hurting inside when hearing stories of breaches of health and safety, 0-hour contracts, and minimum wages, if you're lucky. This is not the way to create a green, vibrant recovery or future. In 2017, the trade unions in our region set up a Just Transition Task Force. This was established after the region was identified as one of the 7 dirtiest regions in the EU. This was because of our heavy industrial base, power generation, steel, chemicals, glass, cement, and food production. Our research told us that with 30,000 direct jobs were at risk from the Paris Climate Agreement, and another 100,000 jobs indirectly affected and at risk if structural and technological change didn't start to happen quickly. We felt that we really needed to get on with this, and we set up our Just Transition Task Force. A number of local and regional politicians, small number of employers joined the trade unions in the task force to begin the planning for building social dialogue, something that we've missed for a long, long time in the UK. And it's crucial to meet the needs of our region. Our main aim at the time was to organise and train our reps in workplaces to be able to enter negotiations and deal with just transition, to sit down with their employers, to reach long-term agreements, planning for retirement policies for staff affected by major changes and displacement, to plan to retrain workers for the new jobs in new industries, and to set a planning train for new skill strategies for young people not yet at work. This has led to the establishment, I'm pleased to report, of an independent climate commission for Yorkshire and the Humber, which is set to be launched on March the 17th. It consists of employers, trade unions, academics and politicians, all committed to establishing social dialogue, to encourage collective bargaining, and I hope sectoral agreements to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the 1980s and beyond this time around. The urgency of this dialogue is crucial for the UK to reach its net zero targets and to provide viable, sustainable futures for everyone in the country. We owe that commitment to our grandchildren and our children. We don't want to make the same mistakes again. And to be fair to the UK government, we are saying that all over Europe and in other parts of the world. And I would say to the government in this country, do as you do overseas nationally, and let's get you around the table talking to the people that matter in our own country. So the region has loads of opportunities, I believe, in spite of the historical mess we created in the 80s. Climate Commission, the first in England, has brought together organisations that can make real change. And to how we achieve that change through cooperation and social dialogue. We all start from a position of needing to reach net zero. Everyone's agreed on that. We all agree that our industry and commerce needs to be sustainable. And we all agree that well-paid, highly skilled and productive jobs are needed to ensure service industries in healthcare, leisure, logistics, housing and transport are clean, modern, accessible to all and affordable. That means valuing every job and providing a stake in the new economy for all. Private investors as well as government are crucial to this transformation. The Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics, representing institutional investors, are partnering with the Commission to make sure investment funds reach the places they are needed. It is vital that areas affected by climate change are targeted for those investments to ensure that no area of the region is disadvantaged. We no longer want abandoned or left behind communities. I'm so encouraged by the response from industry and commerce too. Companies like SSE, who will be speaking later, Drax Power Station, who only last week signed the International Trade Union Pledge to respect and negotiate the changes necessary to achieve a just transition. By the reaction and support of Yorkshire leaders and academics, all of whom are committed to establishing good social partnership with trade unions. Trade unions will sit on the committee and will chair the Employment and Skills Committee underneath with the business organisation, the CBI. We're all committed to working together with third sector groups, something that's taken for granted by most people in Europe, and something that we've been denied in this drive for a market-led economy that we've had in the UK for most of my life. We've got to grab this opportunity together to modernise our great industrial powerhouse, develop and manufacture clean energy sources, provide the skills and education in science and engineering to make sure we have all the tools needed to radically change our society for the better. Change has started, from the Green Energy Humber project to advanced manufacturing in South Yorkshire, to carbon capture schemes, to green transport. My plea to the government is join us and let's do this together. Let's cooperate and build a new world together. Trade union movement in this region at least stands ready to help deliver that new world. Our future and our future generations depend on it. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Bill. And again, thank you for your leadership and the hard work that I know goes into this. But what a good news story, because having this debate go on, having a commission that's about jobs and just transition at the regional level brings us even closer. We need, as you said, Bill, national government and international government prioritisation, but we need the solutions regionally. So I'm very grateful for the work you're doing and the important story that we can share that motivates others. Let's go to Rachel, and I'll come back to you, Ainsley. But Rachel is indeed the Chief Sustainability Officer of the SSE. Now, this is indeed, Rachel, one of the first companies to have published a strategy on just transition. I'd be really curious to know what was the debate and the thinking that led up to that, because it is indeed a good news story. And then tell us about follow-up, because what are the practical ideas and actions that you're taking in the short term to actually meet the aspirations? And what does dialogue look like with the unions as you're creating and sustaining those jobs that are good jobs? So thank you for being with us, Rachel. Thank you for the partnership with trade unions. And this is, as I said, a great news story, and we need more of it.
Thanks very much, Sharon, and thanks ever so much for inviting us to be here. It's a slightly different story, I suppose, and what I'm going to do is just talk you through, I suppose, the thinking that went on in the organisation, but also outside to result in our strategy. And I guess by way of introduction, the company I work for, SSE, we're a large electricity utility, you might tell by my accent, headquartered here in Scotland, and we're wholly focused on the energy markets in the UK and Ireland. And you are right, we seem to be the first company to have published a just transition strategy, but I think there is a good reason why we've done so, and I would hope other companies will do something similar. our entire business strategy, our reason for being, our purpose, and all our actions are effectively being defined by the transition to net zero. And I describe our journey to net zero as being 2/3 of the way there. So not necessarily in terms of time taken, but certainly in terms of carbon emissions. So 10 years ago, we were emitting 25 million tonnes of carbon. That made us one of the largest emitters in the UK. Now it's 8 million tonnes. And that's because we were an electricity generator that was 1/3 coal, 1/3 gas, 1/3 renewables. Now we have no coal and we're reaching 50-50 gas and renewables. Now, my point here is that we aren't, as a company, we aren't starting with a blank sheet of paper. So it is about a transition. And the UK or none of our countries are starting with a blank sheet of paper. We have to transition from one state of being into another. And as Bill explained absolutely perfectly, the industrial transitions of the past are not covered in glory when it comes to their impact on people and communities. So within that context, in November, we published our own Just Transition strategy. And at the core of that strategy are 20 principles to guide us in our investments and our decisions. And we framed that thinking into 2 themes. The first is this notion that we're transitioning into something new and green, precisely at the same time as transitioning out of high carbon activity. So these 2 themes are transitioning in and transitioning out. And to give a sense of scale of the transitioning in, we're investing £7.5 billion in 5 years into low carbon energy infrastructure in the UK and Ireland. And of course, that ought to provide significant opportunity for jobs and economic prosperity. And even last summer, at the height of the pandemic, we were in a fortunate position to be able to create 1,000 direct and indirect jobs as a result of our investment plans. Now, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but there must be standards, safeguards and principles that govern the nature of those new jobs, green jobs being created. So in this strategy and our pillars of principles, we set out principles around those safeguards about the creation of the new. And we set out basic standards such as real living wages, but also the idea of decent work where there's continued learning and the opportunity for progression. But we must also be honest here. What went before in our high carbon activities did not necessarily represent social utopia. Ours is an industry that must be more diverse in gender terms and social background, and with more Black, Asian and ethnic minority participants. So we've set principles on the nature of the new that we're seeking to create and how to guide us towards that. But then there's the second theme, which is really what a lot of what we've been talking about, which is where we as a company are transitioning out of high carbon activity. And our first principle has been deliberately designed to say that while high carbon assets do not have a long-term future, that's coal and gas generation, where we can, we are seeking to repurpose those assets for the net zero world. SSE has high carbon generation plant located in places of strategic importance to the energy system, and they are valuable in the widest sense of value. They provide security of supply to society, but they rely on skills and knowledge of an existing workforce. So if we can, retaining some or all of that value can mean that these assets are repurposed with carbon capture and storage, or in the long term, hydrogen. But sometimes there will be no option to repurpose those generators in the medium term. And when that is the case, we make commitments to our workforce to give notice of change, to work with our trade union representatives, but always to seek to prioritise redeployment and retraining of employees if we can. So Sharon, I'd like to say just a couple of words about the role of trade unions in all of this thinking. And to be perfectly frank, a company like us and a long-term organisation like ours, we do have mature trade union relationships and a framework for partnership and negotiation that goes back a long way, and we have many recognised unions. And those unions can take a lot, perhaps most of the credit for our employer ethos and those principles on decent work that I described a minute ago. But we're also working alongside the Scottish TUC and others on the Scottish Just Transition Commission. I'm a commissioner on that. It's been existing for 2 years. We're going to come out with our final report at the end of this month. But the point here, and why the company has supported this, is that from a company perspective, we have a country level contribution to make here. And the best way to make this point is that those 1,000 new jobs, most of them are in the northeast of Scotland, a real sense of place. But that is in exactly the same place as the North Sea oil and gas industry. And we need workers with science, technology and engineering skills. And establishing transition pathways at a country level for a declining oil and gas sector into the renewable sector is effectively in everybody's best interests. So what I would say, I would describe just now, you know, if you were being critical, you'd say, okay, fine, Rachel, that's a bunch of principles. That's not action. So there are actions that we're pretty clear on, to be perfectly honest, is what are the things that matter most. There's one thing that we haven't discussed at all, but it's something that both the Just Transition Commission in Scotland and the company recognises, is that there are almost endless opportunities for injustice for consumers. And as the years go on, as we transition to net zero, we have to be very careful about this. So from a company perspective, we are concerned about the distributional aspects of who pays for what in the energy transition, but also who gets the benefit. So our electricity network business is working with policymakers and regulators on creating protections that will mean these costs and benefits are fairly distributed. But in terms of job opportunities, and if you listen to our stakeholders, our particular ones in Scotland, then the lack of locally manufactured content in offshore wind supply chain is something that they might consider to contribute to an unjust transition. And while SSE cannot magic up a thriving and competitive manufactured supply chain on our own, we should certainly help. So we've been working closely with those partners, supply partners, and with the UK and Scottish governments to help make that happen. And we're staying close to the trade union movement as we do that. We're very pleased with an announcement a couple of weeks ago by one of our suppliers to invest in a yard in the north of Scotland. And we're hoping for more action from our supply chain soon. And if it's okay, can I make one last point, which is for a company like us, the more just the transition is to net zero, the more chance we have of being commercially successful. If the social consequences of tackling climate change end up in greater inequalities than what we started with, then the people that give the consent and legitimacy, our customers, the society we exist in, their consent and legitimacy will be diminished. So I would describe our actions on a just transition simply as being entirely consistent with our company purpose and I guess our business strategy to support the transition to net zero.
Well, I can see all the trade unionists in the room simply cheering, and because we could do with more partners like you, Rachel, and it's a testimony to you that you endorse the partnerships, because that's our firm belief that working together we can actually make this happen. But I urge everybody to have a look at these principles, because how often do we hear companies talk about not just good green jobs, but in fact guarantees for fair and decent work? Or how do we talk, or boosting inclusion and diversity, or indeed looking at repurposing thermal generators to indeed invest in community, or delivering robust stakeholder consultation, or respecting cultural heritage. That and many other principles, if they're put into practice through partnerships, this is genuinely leadership material, Rachel. So thank you and good luck, and let's indeed elevate your voice everywhere, not just within your sector, but as you said, nationally and broadly in terms of repurposing jobs everywhere. I'm going to go back to Canada, Frederick, and come back to you. We're running just about 3 minutes behind, so I just urge people to keep it tight. But Ainsley, I'm sorry we got out of sync with you, but Ainsley is in fact the Director of the Energy and Environmental Policy Division of the Low Carbon Energy Sector for the Natural Resources Canada. And can I just ask you, Rachel, what role do unions play in coal phase-out efforts? What's been Canada's experience? And the transition to clean energy presents, we know, tremendous opportunities, but you've heard from Tara and Bill and others that, in fact, it's got to actually mean that in reality. So how can governments ensure that workers and communities benefit from this transition? And thank you for being patient.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Just given my previous tech challenges, can you hear me okay? Perfect. I'm very pleased to participate on behalf of the Government of Canada. And as Tara mentioned earlier, I'm joining you from Ottawa, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. It's important to acknowledge this, to remind people who are not Indigenous that they are guests in these territories, and that these territories had complex and culturally specific legal, governance, education, social and justice systems prior to the creation of Canada. So it's important that as I begin this people-focused discussion, it's from a place of recognition and respect for the Algonquin people. In the opening of the summit, Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Minister Wilkinson, spoke to Canada's actions on coal, and I'm pleased to provide further information to build on that. At its core, our work on just transition is underpinned by a firm belief that we can't achieve climate action and the transition to a low-carbon economy without putting people first. Tara has shared her experience on the Just Transition Task Force, and it's an initiative in which we take great pride. It is helping us to chart a path forward, both in terms of what we do, but also critically in how we do it. Canada's unions provided tremendous support through the Just Transition Task Force. It was comprised of 11 members, and more than half came from a union background. This illustrates the primacy of unions' role in this process. And the work of the task force brought to the forefront the critical importance of connecting directly with impacted workers and communities. And we are using that knowledge and that approach to develop programs in response to the coal phase-out. The government has been communicating directly with impacted communities in Canada's 4 coal-producing provinces to address each of their unique needs. I'll point out that we aren't parachuting in outsiders or experts that don't know the lived experience of the community. The government has regional development agencies which are locally based and locally staffed who have built relationships over time. They are truly key to the success of our measures. This has given us an awareness of the differing situations in each region across the country, and we are consciously creating policies and programs that are flexible enough to address the realities of affected communities and their unique circumstances. Through these conversations, communities have identified economic diversification as key to building sustainable industries in their areas. As a result, the Government of Canada put in place the Canada Coal Transition Initiative, a $35 million fund to support a wide variety of projects based on community-identified needs. And to date, 44 projects have been funded, totaling nearly $28 million. In 2019, the Government of Canada announced an additional $150 million in infrastructure funding to support priority infrastructure projects in these communities. Now, beyond the Just Transition Task Force, we are grateful for the key part unions are playing in supporting a successful transition to the low-carbon economy. As just one recent example, the consultation process leading to Canada's Small Modular Reaction Action Plan, which was released in December, included important input from unions. They are nudging employers forward, encouraging them to start developing plans to climate-proof jobs and work. And unions are speaking out about the need for diverse and inclusive workplaces. Our collaboration with unions is ongoing. In support of reaching Canada's climate change targets last week, Minister Wilkinson announced the launch of a net zero advisory body. The advisory body will benefit from the expertise of an esteemed leading voice in Canadian Labour, Hassan Youssef, who is also co-chair of the Just Transition Task Force. Among others, he is joined by John Wright, the former president of Sask Power, who also served on the Just Transition Task Force. Its mandate is to engage Canadians and provide advice to the minister on pathways to achieve net zero by 2050. It will be setting up a transparent and inclusive engagement process. In its mandate, in its membership, in its process, it is quite clear that workers and labourers will continue to guide Canada's path forward on climate action. And if I may pivot to the other point that you were asking about, what are we doing to ensure that workers and communities benefit from the transition? We are absolutely focused on that. In addition to the work we're doing to support coal shutdown affected communities, we have committed more than $1.7 billion to clean up orphan and inactive oil and gas wells, which is expected to create thousands of jobs and provide lasting environmental benefits. The government also recently announced $15 billion for the Strengthened Climate Plan that supports our environmental and economic goals, including well-paid job opportunities for Canadian workers. The Strengthened Climate Plan is a key pillar of the government's commitment to create over 1 million jobs, restoring employment to pre-pandemic levels. Jobs in numerous fields, from retrofitting homes and buildings to tree planting and urban planners in the growing electricity sector, hydrogen down the road, a tremendous number of opportunities. We all know, though, that these good-paying jobs require people with the right skills. In the fall, the Canadian government committed to making the largest investment in Canadian history in training for workers. And this training is a critical contribution to help build that net zero ready workforce. It will include supporting Canadians as they build new skills in growing sectors, helping workers receive the education and accreditation they need, and strengthening workers' futures by connecting them to the employers and good jobs. And we also need a good understanding of what jobs are going to be available. To that end, we are investing $225 million in the Future Skills Initiative to ensure that Canada's skills development policies and programs are aligned with evolving labour market trends. As one piece of this, there was a Future Skills Council that was established, bringing together leaders from labour, nonprofit sectors, the public and the private sector. They released a report in November, and its 5 recommendations point to future efforts the government will need to consider. It also confirmed that many steps we are taking are on the right path. This investment also established the Future Skills Centre, an arm's-length research and innovation centre that is working to help Canadians gain the skills they need to thrive in a changing labour market. And the government is also actively addressing barriers that may have prevented underrepresented and marginalized groups from successfully participating in the workforce. From initiatives such as a Black entrepreneurship strategy to issuing a challenge for organizations to commit to gender equality and diversity on corporate boards, we know we need to harness diverse talents and perspectives. And by setting in place the conditions to reach net zero by 2050, young people will see a future with green, well-paying jobs. Thank you so much, Sharon.
And thank you. And indeed, Ainsley, the partnership is what's important, but also investing in jobs, because we know that with unemployment as it is, and we'll see that when we come to Kasatu in particular and the South African story, investing in jobs as well as all those other initiatives is what it's going to take. But we really appreciate the partnership that comes from Canada and indeed the leadership on this group of governments. So thank you very much. Frederick, an old friend, of course, to many of us in this struggle for just transition, but let me ask you very succinctly, really, that the German Coal Commission, frankly, I think without the role of trade unions wouldn't happen. So tell us what it took and what are the learnings from this? What can other governments learn from this and what now? Thanks, Frederick, and thanks again for all the work that you've put in with your colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon, and thank you for inviting me to this great panel discussion. Maybe just one word to the DGB. The DGB is the umbrella trade union organization in Germany, having 8 member unions covering around about 6 million workers in all sectors of business and public and private services. So the question of coal was a hard struggle in Germany. So coal covers around 30% of our power sector, and looking on the jobs, we have 25,000 jobs directly in the coal sector, in coal mining and coal power plants, and more or less 80,000 jobs which are related to the coal sector, and many more in energy intensive industries which have a deep link to coal power and heat production because of competitive heat and power prices. So when we talked about the coal phase out, we had a long discussion here in Germany, and in 2018 this coal commission was implemented by the German government, and the final report with recommendations was established in January 2019. And in this coal commission, the unions took part, and we negotiated this final report. And when it comes to a coal phase out, this means a very big structural change for the affected regions. In Germany, we do have 3 lignite regions which are affected very deeply. And what were the results? And what was our approach going into this commission? So our approach was bringing a much broader picture into the debate of the coal phase out, because for sure it's about climate policy, but it's also about regional development, economical development. It's about jobs, and all these links also has to be discussed when it comes to a coal phase out. And this approach, I think it was very successful, because we recommended not only such a shutdown logic, recommended a really broad picture for this whole issue. And this is based on 4 pillars, let me tell you. So the first one was that we have a phase out in Germany which is in line with our climate goals in the energy sector. The second pillar is that we do have much more ambition and more investments into the energy transition. So if we want to go out of coal, it's necessary to have much more renewables and the infrastructure and so on. The third pillar is a comprehensive social protection for the workers, which was one of our key points for sure in this whole thing. So having some kind of specific collective bargaining agreements, having some kind of other measures of social protection for the workers in the coal mines and in the power plants. And the fourth point is structural aid for the affected region. As we heard from Tara and Bill before, helping the affected regions is one of the big points. And the German government will spend 40 billion euro until 2083, 2 billion euro per year for investments into new technologies, into new infrastructure, into creating new jobs, new decent jobs. This is a point which we stressed as unions in this commission. And it was also recommended that the social partners will be involved when the money is spent for projects in these regions. And I think this is great to have such a social dialogue on the regional development in the future. After this final report, this legislative process began, and we had a hard struggle to bring the recommendations into reality, to bring it into law. So it has taken 1.5 years, and July 2020, the coal phase out passed our parliament, and since then the implementation has begun. First power plants will be shut down in this year, and now as unions we are working in the companies and also in the political arena on making this coal phase out a reality. I mean, the hard work begins now, because now it's about the jobs and about creating new and decent jobs, and now the real work begins now it has to be shown that the concepts we created are worth the paper they are on. So as unions, as DGB, we will start a project focusing on workers' participation in this regional development, and we want to develop also a union's approach for the structural development in these affected regions, I think, which is necessary to be able to create new and decent jobs. Maybe as a result, 5 points for the governments and for those who want to talk about this coal phase out in the next years. I think the first point is the workers are the key to the transitions. They are at the very core of the transition, of the transformation, because they know about their job, about their business, they have skills. So it is necessary to take their knowledge into this whole process. Second point is, it is necessary to leave no one behind. Yeah, that's a buzzword for us as unionists, but it's really necessary, and have this kind of security measures on board. The third point is the social dialogue. So as we heard from Rachel, it is really worthwhile to have this kind of social partnership and work together in these questions of transformation. Fourth point is that we need some kind of political framework. So without a stable political framework, no one will invest, nothing will be developed. So this is really a big thing. And the last thing is, yeah, it's all about investments. If we want to be much more ambitious with the climate policy, it's about much more investments in less time. So we have to talk about how to spend more public money and also private money for climate investments. Thank you so much.
Indeed, Frederick, it is all about investment. There's no doubt about that. We need policy, stability, certainty for the direction and the transformation, as Rachel said, but we need investment, and it is public and private, and it must drive jobs as well as, of course, reduce emissions and set us up on that sustainable path. I wanted to say thank you to all the panelists. I'm sorry, but given the nature of the time, we don't have time for discussion, but you know, these stories are so important to share, to understand, you know, what it has resulted in, where people are on the journey. But trade unions are doing a terrific job, and thank you to our government and industry partners who are joining us in what has to be indeed the biggest struggle of our life. Now, you at least have governments who are indeed part of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. So you have a commitment from your governments. But we have brave trade unionists, really brave trade unionists who are doing great work outside of that. And so I thought we should hear from a couple of those, and then of course from Sam, who's doing an extraordinary job as our director of the Transition Centre, helping unions to the table and bringing people together around shared experiences. But let me introduce a woman who is just extraordinary. Lebo Hang Malaysia is in fact an incredible woman. We know her as Lebo because it's much easier to say, first of all, but she looks younger than she is, first of all, but she is indeed the Labour Market Policy Coordinator, Congress of South African Trade Unions. And she's got a story for you that comes in the context of extraordinary challenges in that society and that economy. 40% unemployment, 40% unemployment, and then informality on top of that. So COSATU's been a union movement leader on the issue of just transition. And you know, Lebo, can I ask you to describe what COSATU is doing around the jobs question? Because yes, it's about climate, but it's also about jobs, full stop. And your jobs plan is extraordinary. And then what does it mean for workers in the power sector and mining? And we know you've got a big struggle going on against corruption, but also for the sustainability of the South Australia's utilities, like the the public Eskom company, or corporation. So tell us, what is it like, and what is COSATU doing? Because it's a great story.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for the introduction. Just being a part of this panel and listening to the great stories that our colleagues around the world are sharing, it's great learning for us, and with some of the endeavors that we've taken as a trade union federation. Maybe just to start off, COSATU is a trade union federation, the biggest in South Africa. We organize 19 affiliates, and we have the huge responsibility of transitioning our affiliates towards a just energy transition. It's been one hell of a ride. I remember when I started in COSATU in my first year. If you think I look young now, I was way younger then. An elderly man stood up. He was in one of our training sessions, and I know Sam has been to our training centers. So he stood at the back, and while I was giving this enthusiastic presentation about, a just energy transition and how we need to save the environment, he raised his hand and he said, I hear you speak wonderful English. It's a sign of your education, but what does this just energy transition mean for me and my job? I am not only the breadwinner for my children, but I'm also a breadwinner for my grandchildren. And ever since then, Sharon, what we've done is we've placed jobs at the center of anything that we do pertaining to our adaptation mitigation of just transition work. And that brings me to what we did when it came to our power utility Eskom. So for those of you who don't know, the power utility, we've got one major power utility in South Africa, produces and generates and transmits 95% of our electricity, 90% of which is coal generated. Through the Presidential Climate Change Commission, we'll be looking to actively change that 90%. But currently this is what it's looking like. We sat in a situation last year. Everybody else saw the financial crisis that the power utility faced as a problem. We sat around the table and we saw it as an opportunity. We chose not to lament. We chose not to present what the problems were, but we decided to be more strategic in our approach. Back then, the power utility owned 454 billion in debt. Now, I don't even have to mention what our currency is. That as a number alone tells you how unsustainable that is for any business to be facing. And really what the power utility, and this is the only utility that's responsible for 95% of our electricity generation. So this was too big of an elephant to fail, too big of an organization to fail. So we sat around our table. When we look at Eskom, 40,000 of our workers and membership is organized within the power utility. So over and above the 40,000 that we were looking at, we looked at this utility that generates 90% of its energy via coal. We looked at this as a possible pilot for how we would want to transition to a low carbon economy. And I'll explain in just a little while how we managed to do that. So we looked at this 454 billion rand, and we thought we're definitely going to need a large sum of money to play a role in assisting the power utility to drastically reduce this debt that they're currently sitting with. So by having debt of this nature, it means that the power utility, would struggle with repairs, would struggle with maintenance, and would just struggle to do its day-to-day operations. So what we then decided to do is, we're already an investor through the Public Investment Corporation. The biggest investor are the workers through the Government Employee Pension Fund. We looked at this debt and we decided, how about we reduce this debt by 50% through our stake in the power utility? So we were going to purchase 50%. Of the debt, convert that equity and convert that debt into equity for workers. So first, we would be doing one of the things we've promised workers ever since the inception of the Trade Federation, that they would become owners of the means of production. So that was the first objective that we were wanting to achieve. And then secondly, we then said, if we come in as investors in this big power utility, we could change their business model. So by doing that, what we'd actively be doing is assisting this giant power utility to undergo a process of a just energy transition to become a player in the renewable energy space. And how they would do that is to practicalize what we talk about, not leaving the workers behind. And we would start by not leaving the current workers that are employed by the power utility. So we've been in that process to date. We finally had this compact signed, albeit getting a lot of criticism from most voices in society. They couldn't understand why we were wanting to do this. People thought that we were trying to put money into a black hole. But really what we were doing is to fulfill these two important imperatives, which is to allow workers to have stake in the means of production, and secondly, to change the business model of the power utility. So we're at the point where we've had agreement between ourselves, the business constituency, community members, as well as government to start generating this financial vehicle, which is not solely funded by, the government employee pension scheme. There is a small stake that government has put in. There is a small stake of money that the business fraternity has also put into this venture. So what it really means is that by the time we're done with the implementation framework, we will have achieved this target. So maybe let me move on to, why we wanted there to be a difference in the business case of the power utility. So we looked at the renewable energy sector currently in South Africa, very much a private space currently. So it's only 5% of our energy generation so far, and all of it is within the hands of the private sector. We viewed this as not being sustainable. We subscribe to the notion that electricity generation and security needs to be in the hands to a large extent of the public sector. And this we do because of our historical issues pertaining to, expanding access to electricity for indigent and mostly poor households. So we've positioned this large power utility as a possible player now in renewable energy generation, and that's the victories that we've been able to win thus far. A second victory, Sharon, that we've been able to win is the establishment of the Presidential Climate Change Commission. So this has been a plea from all courts of society, but we pushed through this in the Job Summit in 2018, where we brought to government's attention that there needs to be a synergy in the way in which we understand this concept of a just transition. So when I started my input, I indicated that our understanding around the just transition is that it needs to mean jobs. And this ties into the point, that the elderly man made to me in an input around issues pertaining to the just transition. So it means different things for different people in society. So we've brought to the government's attention that we need to have a plan, and that plan needs to talk to, what the just transition means for a person who's in a community where a coal-fired power station used to be, and that station is about to be decommissioned. What does that person believe a just transition needs to be? For the business sector who want to be a player and who want to invest in a just transition, what must a just transition mean for them? And then we need to come together in a consensus-seeking platform in order to address each of our concerns around the just transition. It's been recently established, and I think to date we've even made victories in that regard. I mean, we looked at the terms of reference and we decided that, previously, and I think this has been the case in South Africa, over the last 10 years, how we've planned for the just transition is that if we answer the environmental question and we make the business case, we think that there'll be a trickle down of jobs. And that's not how you deal with a society with 40% unemployment. You have to be more deliberate in how you deal with issues of unemployment, and they need to be at the center of the just transition. We've been very successful in pushing for there to be work streams that target human capabilities within the just transition, which target pathways to be able to identify how, when we get to net zero in 2050, what will the workers in the energy sector look like? So we've been able to alter the Commission's terms of reference in order to be more specific and be more direct as to how we tackle this issue issue of unemployment. It's systemic. It's a structural problem, and we need to be more direct when dealing with it. We're at the beginning stages of.
Sorry, Lebo, 1 minute.
Yes, absolutely. We're in the beginning stages of all of this. We're completely excited. I always tell our colleagues, if we shouldn't be a part of processes where we're not going to create any change. So the fact that we're sitting on this Presidential Climate Change Commission, at the end of it, we must have achieved something great. We've got an opportunity to reduce unemployment significantly in our country through the establishment of a renewable energy sector. And this is our time to make our mark. Thank you very much, Sharon.
Thank you, and for the incredible work. And of course, we never have enough time, but it gives people a flavour of just how deeply you are engaged, not just with the thinking and the policy, but with making it happen. I want to go to Mariano Sanz, who is indeed a Spanish colleague. He's the Confederal Secretary on Environment, Energy and Mobility for CCOO, or Comisioneros as we know them, the Spanish Trade Union Confederation of Workers. Mariano, we all know just how critical your role and other trade unionists were in achieving the Just Transition Agreement there. Can you actually tell us, what you did to secure not just the agreement, but the money amounting to about 250 million euros into a Just Transition Fund for workers and their communities, and what lessons have we learned that we need to take on board in other sectors? Mariano, thank you for joining us. Mariano will speak in Spanish, but if you go to your interpretation function, you'll hear it in your language of choice. I think English, Spanish is provided. Mariano.
Very well. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining this interesting and important panel. I will try to explain how are we facing this issue and when we identify the just transition needs, and most of our projects are ongoing in Spain. Just transition processes are ongoing, connected with the closing of mines, with the closing of thermal plants. 8 are on the process to being closed, and also 2 nuclear plants are going to be dismantled. Let me share with you how we manage all of these processes, because I believe this will be the template that we will use when other transformation projects come to us. And with all the adjustments that need to be made to customize the needs of each territory, we're going to follow the same path. In general, our strategic framework for climate and energy, we have a document as our main structure that specifies 3 main pillars for our actions. First of all is the National Energy Plan, which is the roadmap for the path to decarbonization from 2020 to 2030. This is linked, of course, to mobility and the climate transition. We also have the Bill of Law for Climate Change and Energy Transition, which is the roadmap for all the climate policy that will be implemented in the short and long haul that are to be approved by the Parliament in April. And lastly, this is the core of my talk, is the Spanish strategy for a just transition. This is a document that adds up to the previous 2, where we define the goals and the policy to use all the potential of any transition process and to address the negative and adverse effect for transitions, because we don't want anybody to be left behind and we want our transitions to be just. We are convinced in Spain that in the midterm we will have to face transition projects. We have started with energy, but for example, yesterday we had a discussion with with the International Trade Union Confederation in other areas. This strategy, well, has a set of goals to take advantage of the available jobs. There are cross-cutting areas as well to have more equality in our jobs. And this will trigger structural policy creation needed for a just transition. We will have in the future specific transition areas. Probably more training will be needed. New capabilities will have to be created. We will need more policies related to renewable energies in the future. And in a way, what we're trying to do is to identify potential areas where we can step ahead of the adverse effects of a transition. And there are two fundamental strategies. We need the Fair Transition Agreement. This is the first document that we address. We have to identify which parts of the process will be affected. And then the second document is the Urgent Action Document for Just Transition Practices. The first is the Just Transition Document. This is the first strategy to step into the territories where a mine is going to be closed. This is not necessarily a collective bargaining agreement. This is a political covenant where you have the labor ministry, the social ministry, the industry ministry, and the ecological transition ministry acting together with representation from the autonomous communities and local authorities, let's say the representatives of the local authorities. And the main purpose is to have a comprehensive action plan addressing the affected area, and we agree with the government to identify specific actions with clear funding and with a timeline set. This for just transition agreements follow two paths. On the one hand, the first phase is where we identify who is going to be part of it. We do our research, we have all the information needed, we have identified who is going to represent which ministry, and we need to create political synergies, but also we need funding. And this first phase enables us to have more participation from society in general, and on the other hand, helps us to create a diagnosis of the status of the region. What is the potential found in that area, and what kind of projects could be worked on? Then we move to phase two, where we identify which projects are possible. We evaluate the feasibility of projects, and we identify which ones fit better in the transition process, and we confirm that the working conditions and the stability of those companies are clearly understood and commitments are made in order to be reflected in this agreement. And the last step is the final list of projects that are going to be approved by all the stakeholders. We have created a coordinating agency, the Spanish Institute for Just Transitions, and this is the body that oversees all of these activities. This is an official body that was created by another ministry that addressed all mining issues. This ministry has transformed, that they have technically trained staff, which is very valid. So they provide technical assistance, legal assistance, and all the entities that want to present projects, they go to them, they evaluate the projects, and then they identify the ways to collaborate between ministries so that all of these projects are successful. Right now, we have 13 just transition agreements, and we have in the pipeline 4 more. For some projects, we have covered all the research process to become public, specifically for those areas where we have mining projects that are to be closed down, and we have thermal plants, and for obvious reasons, the effects of those close downs are going to be extensive. And we have many organizations joining these efforts. I'm talking about around 500 organizations, private sector trade unions, and every voice is considered in the process to identify what should be incorporated in the Just Transition Agreement. Of course, we as CCOO, we are part of it. We have 1,400 projects that have been received from different industries. Spain has a lot of potential for renewable energies. We have big companies in this project. We have also forestry projects, food production projects, and tourism. We are facing an atypical moment. Otherwise, without all the challenges that the outbreak has posed to us, we would have more projects in a different phase. But we are somehow in a stalemate because the ministry is trying to adapt the agreements with all the possibilities that are linked to resiliency and recovery in Europe. This is a very important element that we need to use as leverage. In this context, we have to understand that nothing would have been possible if we had not had in the past agreements. We had the carbon agreement and the Just Transition Agreement for the close down of thermal plants. These are not just bilateral agreements. These are agreements where we have participation from the territories and state governments. And from there, we have agreed in different areas. We have financial commitments, but also companies that are engaged in the process to close down the thermal plants. It is their responsibility to present alternative projects to give back to the ecological transition in the process. And I'm wrapping up. For us, Just Transition Agreements are key. We are somehow fine-tuning the process. It is very different from what we did when we had reconversion carbon projects, because the funds were used for two purposes: helping the workers that were going to lose their jobs, and another path was to use those funds for building infrastructure and to using these funds for companies that sometimes when they would close their business activities, they would leave these areas. And we believe that this is an opportunity. This kind of this way of reaching agreements is beneficial. We are facing a moment in time where the potential results have to be drafted into the short and the long haul. The short term can be difficult, but we believe that this is the right path. We are working as well with our authorities to have specific proposals to address renewable energy possibilities for those areas where there will be more difficulties in the future. And we believe that we have a lot of room to maneuver with the tools that we have at hand. We have to work as unions together. We work together with our sections and with our federations of our confederations, and this is the outcome of this common work. And we are also helping all the stakeholders to understand when this issue gets to their territories, they are prepared. Just Transition has 4 pillars: measures to protect our workers. You need to provide hope, and you need to be prepared. You need to provide alternatives to relocate jobs. It is not possible that you need to act just when you have the issue right at your face. We need to plan ahead of time. If we want to see stability, we need investments, not only private investments, public investments. We need to have standards. We need a stable legal framework. And fourth, we need to have new control measures for all funds and projects that are accepted. Energy, digital, and climate transition is a challenge. We're seeing it in Europe, but as trade unions, we are being put to a test. We need to show that we are capable to react. We need to solve conflicts in in a way that we envision all of what we've learned from the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana, and I'm so sorry about the lack of time, but you've made a critical journey to date, and I know you're now investing in transition in every sector, heavy industry, automotive, cities, so there's no doubt that your work is valued by us and we see it as critical, and those principles are right. But you know, you said it, that the challenge is to plan ahead. And I think, you know, after the Paris Agreement and putting just transition, finally achieving it in the, with the support of a lot of allies, who included Sam in her previous job at WWF, I woke up the next day or maybe a couple of days after and said, oh my God, we can't do this from our desks at the ITUC. We have to support unions to do exactly what you said, Mariana, make the plan, get ahead of it, make the demands and actually be at the table with the knowledge. So I asked Sam Smith if she would actually come and work for us, and she generously has, and she's built a fantastic team who I don't have time to introduce to all of you. But Sam, I'm sorry you only have 5 minutes, but tell us what it takes in your view. What lessons have we learned and what's next?
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thanks to all of the speakers today. So I also want to start by thanking you, Sharon Burrow, for your leadership on this issue, because there are a lot of things that would not have been possible without you going out front and going in first on the need to fight dangerous climate change, but also to get a just transition for workers. And beyond that, I want to recognize not only the sisters and brothers on this call for everything that you've done to get a just transition for our members, but also all of our rank and file members and leaders who have fought so hard on these issues over many years. So what you're hearing today is really the result of that collective work from many, many people in the trade union movement and from our allies. And I just want to highlight a few of the things that we've heard. I mean, what we've heard and our own experience in the Just Transition Center when we are working with unions to get these plans is that you have to start with jobs. So the very first question that all of our members have, if you say to them, okay, this big change is coming to your sector or to the plant or whatever, is what's going to happen to my job? What are the new jobs? And how do I get from here to there? And unless we can answer those questions, we're really not going to get anywhere on this rapid climate action that we need. I think Mariano said it very clearly just now, that you have to plan ahead. And so if we wait until the moment when the plant is about to close, if we give people 4 months notice to find a new job in a region that really doesn't have other industries, then what's going to happen is not only is there no just transition, but you're creating a group of people, as we also heard about the UK, who may then have generations of social misery, but also be opponents of climate action. So to bring this back to the call to action of the UN Secretary General, I mean, the point of just transition is not only that it's fair and right and consistent with our rights as workers, but if you really care about climate change, you should care at least as much about getting a just transition so that more people are on board and see this as something that is going to be good for them, their families, and their communities, as opposed to seeing climate action as something that only closes stuff down and loses jobs. We have heard a lot today about the struggle of getting those new jobs on the table and the need for investment, especially public investment. We've heard about the potential for workers to invest our capital, our pension funds in the transition, not only in South Africa, but in other countries. We've heard even more about the need for social dialogue, this fundamental principle of just transition, involving workers and unions, employers and government, in order to get these agreements for how we move forward. I think I just want to close by saying that, what you've heard today is really just a small selection of the different unions around the world that are working on this issue, not only in the energy transition, not only fighting for good jobs in the new sectors like renewable energy, but also on issues ranging from steel and auto to cement and to agriculture, transportation, and construction. The basic principles are the same. All jobs need to be good. All jobs need to be low emissions if we really are going to get to net zero. So I hope that if anyone who's watching, if you have questions about what you heard or questions about just transition, first, go and read the ILO's guidelines for just transition, which is Secretary General has explained our, bare minimum, our sort of basic plan for getting this to happen. But second, feel free to reach out to us, right? As trade unionists, it's also our job to talk to you and to explain to you what you could do to encourage a just transition in different countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, but mostly Sam and I and Jackie and Sebastian and indeed Montserrat would, all of us, plus of course our team at the ITC, want to thank you, because there is no doubt that this is just the start. This is the biggest systemic change business, unions, governments will face in our lifetimes. And COVID-19 made it that much harder in many ways, but in other ways has painted the clear need for us to have a socially and environmentally just future. And this morning we had a huge discussion about reform of multilateralism, and that includes the WTO and that floor of labour rights and environmental standards that we need to make sure drives a new economic model that is sustainable both socially and environmentally. So we have work to do. We always have work to do, but it seems like it's a very big challenge right now. And I know, Rachel, that the companies leading this are finding they're pretty lonely too, because there are many companies that, just like many of our communities and workers who are frightened, don't want to change. So thank you all. I'm not going to give you any more words today. We're a few minutes over, Jackie. I apologise, and to our interpreter. But it was a great discussion. You are doing fantastic work, and I can only say thank you all for being leaders in what is an imperative for all of us. Take care.